The crackling sound of burning wood filled the quiet mountain air as David stirred the glowing embers with a long stick. 3 days had passed since he'd driven his old pickup truck up the winding mountain road, leaving behind the noise and chaos of city life. The campsite was perfect, tucked away in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, with a crystal-clear stream running just 50 feet away. David had always loved camping, but this trip was different. This wasn't a vacation or a weekend getaway. This was an escape. 2 weeks ago, his boss had called him into the office and delivered news that hit him like a punch to the gut. The company was downsizing, and after 12 years of loyal service, David was being let go. Just like that, his steady paycheck and sense of security vanished. The timing couldn't have been worse. His divorce papers had been finalized just a month earlier, and now he was living in a small apartment, trying to figure out what to do next. His ex-wife had gotten the house, and he was starting over at 42 years old. The mountains had always been his place to think, to find peace when life got overwhelming. As the sun began to set behind the jagged peaks, David opened his cooler and took inventory of his remaining supplies. He had planned this trip to last 5 days, but his appetite had been poor since losing his job. Stress had a way of making even his favorite foods taste like cardboard. He counted what was left: 1 can of chicken soup, a small sleeve of crackers, 2 bottles of water, and a few energy bars. It would be enough to get him through tomorrow, and then he'd head back to town to face reality. The fire popped and sent sparks dancing up toward the darkening sky. David pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders and reached for his thermos of coffee. The nights were getting colder as autumn settled over the mountains, and he was grateful for the thick sleeping bag his brother had given him years ago. The warmth of the fire felt good on his face, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a small sense of peace. That's when he heard it, a rustling sound coming from the thick brush about 30 yards away. David froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. His first thought was bear. He'd seen plenty of black bears in these mountains over the years, and they were usually more afraid of humans than humans were of them. But this sound was different. It wasn't the heavy, deliberate movement of a large animal. It was erratic, almost desperate. David stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line. The rustling continued, getting closer. He reached for the flashlight beside his camping chair and clicked it on, sending a bright beam into the darkness. The beam swept across the trees and undergrowth, but he couldn't see anything unusual. Then the sound stopped completely for a moment. Everything was silent except for the crackling of the fire and the gentle babbling of the nearby stream. David was about to sit back down when he heard something that made his blood run cold, a human voice, weak and barely audible, calling for help. "Hello?" David called out, his voice echoing off the surrounding mountains. "Is someone there?" The response was immediate, but so faint he almost missed it. "Help, please, The voice was definitely female, and she sounded like she was in serious trouble. David grabbed his flashlight and started moving toward the sound, his heart pounding. As he pushed through the low-hanging branches and thick undergrowth, he kept calling out to let her know he was coming. The terrain was rough, with fallen logs and loose rocks that could easily trip someone in the dark. Then he saw her. A young woman emerged from behind a large boulder, stumbling and swaying like she was drunk. But David could tell immediately that alcohol wasn't the problem. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair was tangled with leaves and twigs, and her face was pale as a ghost. She was wearing hiking boots and what had once been a nice outdoor jacket, but everything was covered in mud and pine needles. "Oh, thank God," she whispered when she saw David's flashlight. "I thought I was going to die out here." She took 2 more unsteady steps toward the light, and then her legs gave out completely. David lunged forward and caught her just before she hit the ground. She was shivering uncontrollably, and her skin felt cold and clammy. He could feel how thin she was through her jacket, and he realized she probably hadn't eaten in days. "I've got you," David said, his voice calm and reassuring, despite the alarm bells going off in his head. "You're going to be okay. My campsite is right over here." The woman tried to respond, but her words came out as an incoherent mumble. David realized she was probably suffering from dehydration and exhaustion, possibly hypothermia. He'd seen similar symptoms during his army days, and he knew she needed help immediately, supporting most of her weight. David half carried, half dragged her through the brush toward his campsite. The fire was still burning brightly, and the warm orange glow seemed to give her a little strength. As they got closer to the flames, she looked up at him with tired but grateful eyes. "What's your name?" David asked as he helped her sit down. "On a fallen log near the fire." "Kelly," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been lost for I don't know how long." 2 days, maybe 3. David's mind raced as he looked at her condition. She was clearly in bad shape, but she was conscious and talking, which was a good sign. He needed to get her warm and get some fluids into her system as quickly as possible, without hesitation. David went to his tent and grabbed his only blanket, a thick wool blanket his grandmother had made for him years ago. It was one of his most treasured possessions, but he didn't think twice about wrapping it around Kelly's shoulders. She pulled it tight around herself and scooted closer to the fire. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "I can't believe I found you. I was starting to think ... She didn't finish the sentence, but David understood. She had been starting to think she might not make it out of these mountains alive. David looked at his meager food supplies and made a quick decision. Kelly needed nourishment more than he did. He grabbed the can of chicken soup and his small camping pot, then filled it with water from one of his bottles. As he set the pot over the fire to heat, he could see Kelly watching him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "I don't have much," David said, "but you're welcome to whatever I've got. You need to get some food in you." Kelly's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand," she said. "I haven't eaten anything in 2 days. I ran out of water yesterday morning. I thought I was going to die out here." As the soup began to warm, David sat down beside her and listened as she told him what had happened. She had been hiking alone on what she thought was a well-marked trail when she took a wrong turn. Her phone had died and she had wandered deeper and deeper into the wilderness, becoming completely disoriented. The more she had walked, the more lost she had become. David stirred the soup and watched as some color slowly returned to Kelly's cheeks. The warmth of the fire and the security of finding another human being were already helping her recover. But he knew she still had a long way to go, and he was determined to do everything he could to help her make it through the night. The soup was finally warm enough to eat, and David carefully poured it into his metal camping mug. Steam rose from the liquid, carrying the comforting smell of chicken broth into the cool mountain air. Kelly's hands were shaking so badly that David had to help her hold the mug steady as she took her first sip. "Slow down," he said gently, watching as she tried to gulp the soup too quickly. "I know you're hungry, but your stomach needs time to adjust. Small sips." Kelly nodded and forced herself to drink more slowly. With each sip, David could see her body relaxing a little more. The color was starting to return to her face, and her violent shivering was beginning to calm down. She wrapped the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and moved even closer to the fire. "This is the best soup I've ever had in my life," she said, managing a weak smile. "I can't believe you're sharing your food with me. You don't even know me." David shrugged and broke his sleeve of crackers in half, offering her the larger portion. "You needed it more than I did. Besides, my mom always taught me to help people when they're in trouble." As Kelly slowly ate the crackers, she began to tell David more about what had happened to her. She had been hiking alone, which she admitted wasn't the smartest decision. She was 24 years old and had just graduated from college with a degree in environmental science. The hiking trip was supposed to be a celebration, a way to clear her head before starting her job search. "I thought I knew these mountains pretty well," she said, her voice growing stronger with each bite of food. "I've been hiking here since I was a kid with my dad, but I guess I got overconfident. I took what I thought was a shortcut to get to the main trail, and before I knew it, I was completely lost." David listened carefully as she described the past 3 days. She had started her hike on Monday morning, planning to be back by Tuesday evening. When she realized she was lost on Tuesday, she had tried to retrace her steps, but nothing looked Familiar. Her phone had died on Tuesday night, and she had spent Wednesday walking in circles, growing more desperate by the hour. I found a small stream yesterday and drank some water, but I ran out of food on Tuesday, she continued. I was starting to panic. I kept thinking about my parents, wondering if they had called the police yet. They're probably worried sick. David nodded, understanding the fear in her voice. He had been lost in the wilderness once during his army training, and he remembered the growing sense of panic as the hours passed. But Kelly had been lost for 3 days, which was far more dangerous. The worst part was last night, Kelly said, her voice barely above a whisper. I found a small cave to sleep in, but I couldn't get warm. I was so cold and hungry that I started hallucinating. I kept hearing voices calling my name, but when I would call back, there was nothing there. David felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that hallucinations were often a sign of severe dehydration and exhaustion. Kelly had been much closer to death than she probably realized. I woke up this morning and I could barely stand up, she continued. I knew I was in serious trouble. I started walking again, but I felt like I was moving in slow motion. Everything was foggy, and I kept stumbling over rocks and roots. She paused to take another sip of soup, and David could see tears forming in her eyes. I was starting to think I might not make it out of here alive, she said. I kept thinking about my parents, about my little sister. I had so many things I wanted to do with my life, and I thought it might all be over because I made one stupid mistake. David reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder. Hey, you're safe now. You made it. That's what matters. Kelly looked at him with gratitude that went beyond words. When I saw your fire through the trees, I thought I was hallucinating again. I almost didn't come toward it because I was afraid it wasn't real. As the night wore on, David kept the fire burning, bright and hot. He gave Kelly the rest of his crackers and opened one of his energy bars, splitting it with her. She protested, saying he was giving her too much of his food, but David insisted. He had been in the army for 6 years and he knew how to go without food for a day or two if necessary. Kelly, on the other hand, needed every bit of nourishment she could get. Tell me about yourself, Kelly said as they sat by the fire. What brought you out here all alone? David hesitated for a moment, then decided there was no point in hiding the truth. I lost my job 2 weeks ago. The company I worked for decided to downsize, and after 12 years, they let me go. My divorce was finalized last month, so I've been dealing with a lot of changes lately. Kelly listened intently, and David found himself opening up more than he had to anyone in months. There was something about sitting by a campfire in the middle of the wilderness that made it easy to be honest. I needed to get away and think, he continued. These mountains have always been my place to find peace. My dad used to bring me camping here when I was a kid, and some of my best memories are from trips like this. I'm sorry about your job. And your divorce, Kelly said softly. That must be really hard to deal with. David nodded. It's been tough. I've been feeling pretty lost myself lately, wondering what I'm supposed to do next. Funny thing is, helping you tonight has made me feel more useful than I have in weeks. As the temperature continued to drop, David realized that Kelly was still shivering despite the fire and the blanket. He knew that hypothermia was still a real danger, especially since she had been exposed to the cold for so long. Here, he said, unzipping his sleeping bag, you need to get inside this. Your body temperature is still too low. Kelly started to protest, but David was firm. I'll be fine. I've got my jacket and I can keep the fire going. You need to get warm and get some rest. Reluctantly, Kelly crawled into the sleeping bag and David zipped it up around her. Almost immediately, she stopped shivering. The down insulation trapped her body heat, and for the first time in days, she felt truly warm. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes already growing heavy. I don't know how I can ever repay you for this. You don't need to repay me, David said, adding another log to the fire. Just get some rest. We'll figure out how to get you home in the morning. As Kelly drifted off to sleep, David settled into his camping chair and pulled his jacket tight around him. The night was going to be cold, but he had survived worse during his military training. He fed the fire regularly, making sure it stayed bright and hot throughout the night, every hour or so. He checked on Kelly to make sure she was breathing normally and that she hadn't developed a fever. He had given her his last bottle of water before she fell asleep, and he could see that the hydration and warmth were helping her body recover. David didn't sleep much that night. He dozed fitfully in his chair, one eye always on the fire and one ear listening for any sounds that might indicate trouble. But mostly he found himself thinking about how strange life could be. 3 days ago, he had been feeling sorry for himself, wondering if his life had any real purpose. Now he was literally saving someone's life, and it felt like the most important thing he had ever done. The first rays of sunlight crept through the pine trees, painting the campsite in soft golden light. David had been awake for most of the night, keeping the fire burning and checking on Kelly every hour. His back ached from sleeping in the camping chair, and his eyes felt heavy from lack of sleep, but he felt more alert than he had in weeks. Kelly was still sleeping peacefully in his sleeping bag, her breathing steady and normal. The color had returned to her face, and she no longer looked like she was at death's door. David quietly added another log to the fire and put his small camping pot on to heat some water. He had one energy bar left and a small packet of instant coffee, not much, but it would have to do. As the water began to warm, Kelly stirred and opened her eyes. For a moment she looked confused, as if she couldn't remember where she was. Then she saw David sitting by the fire, and relief flooded her face. "Good morning," David said with a smile. "How are you feeling?" Kelly sat up slowly, still wrapped in the sleeping bag. "Better, much better. I actually feel human again." She looked around the campsite and then back at David. "You stayed up all night, didn't you?" David shrugged. "I dozed a little. I wanted to make sure you were okay and keep the fire going. You needed the warmth more than I needed a comfortable bed." Kelly's eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe you did that for me. You gave me your food, your blanket, your sleeping bag, and then you stayed up all night to take care of me. I'm a complete stranger." "You're not a stranger anymore," David said, pouring hot water over the instant coffee. "Besides, I told you, my mom raised me to help people when they're in trouble." Kelly smiled and wiped her eyes. "Your mom sounds like a wonderful person." "She was," David said softly. "She passed away 5 years ago, but I still hear her voice in my head sometimes, especially when I'm trying to figure out the right thing to do." They shared the energy bar and the coffee, talking quietly as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Kelly told David more about her family. Her parents were both teachers, and her younger sister was still in high school. She had been planning to call them when she got back from her hike to tell them about some job interviews she had lined up. "They're probably frantic with worry by now," Kelly said. "I was supposed to be back Tuesday night, and today is Thursday. They've probably called the police and organized search parties." David nodded. "We need to get you back to civilization as soon as possible. Do you have any idea which direction you came from?" Kelly shook her head. "I've been wandering in circles for so long that I have no idea where I am. I thought I was heading toward the main trail yesterday, but I ended up getting more lost." David studied the surrounding mountains, using his knowledge of the area to get his bearings. He had been coming to these mountains for 20 years, and he knew most of the major trails and landmarks. Based on the position of the sun and the distinctive peaks he could see, he estimated they were about 5 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. "I think I know where we are," he said. "There's a fire tower about 3 miles northeast of here. If we can get to it, we can signal for help." Kelly's face lit up with hope. "Do you really think we can make it?" "I know we can," David said with confidence. "But we need to be smart about it. You're still recovering, and we don't have much food or water left. We'll take it slow and rest whenever you need to." David began packing up his campsite, but he made sure to leave his heaviest items behind. Kelly was still weak, and he didn't want her to have to carry anything unnecessary. He kept only the essentials: his emergency whistle, a small mirror for signaling, his first aid kit, and what little food and water they had left. "Here," David said, handing Kelly his spare jacket. "Put this on. The temperature can drop quickly at this altitude, and you need to stay warm." Kelly put on the jacket, which was much too big for her, but it provided extra insulation. David also gave her his hiking gloves and a wool hat. He was keeping only his basic outer layer, but he figured he could handle the cold better than she could. As they prepared to leave the campsite, David pulled out his emergency whistle and began blowing it in the international distress signal, 3 short blasts, followed by 3 long blasts, then 3 short blasts again. The sound echoed off the surrounding mountains, and they both listened carefully for any response. "SOS," Kelly said, recognizing the pattern. "Exactly," David replied. "If there are any other hikers or search teams in the area, this might get their attention." They waited for several minutes, but there was no response. David wasn't discouraged. He knew the whistle could be heard from miles away, and someone might hear it even if they couldn't respond immediately. "Let's start walking," David said, shouldering his small backpack. "We'll try the whistle every 20 minutes or so." The hike toward the fire tower was challenging, especially for Kelly, even though she was feeling much better than the night before. 3 days of being lost in the wilderness had taken a toll on her strength. David stayed close beside her, ready to help if she stumbled or needed to rest. They had been walking for about an hour when they heard it, the distant sound of helicopter rotors. David's heart jumped with excitement, and he immediately began digging in his pack for his signaling mirror. "There!" Kelly pointed to the sky, where a small helicopter was visible in the distance. David angled the mirror to catch the sunlight, and began flashing it toward the helicopter. The bright reflection would be visible for miles, and he hoped the pilot would see it and investigate. "They're coming this way," Kelly shouted, her voice filled with excitement and relief. The helicopter was indeed changing course, heading in their direction. David continued flashing the mirror while Kelly waved her arms above her head. As the aircraft got closer, they could see it was a search and rescue helicopter with bright orange markings. The helicopter circled their position twice before finding a suitable landing spot in a small clearing about 100 yards away. David and Kelly made their way toward the landing site, Kelly leaning on David's arm for support. 2 paramedics jumped out of the helicopter before the rotors had even stopped spinning. They were followed by a search and rescue coordinator who immediately began asking questions about Kelly's condition. "How long has she been missing?" the coordinator asked David. 3 days, David replied. "She was severely dehydrated and exhausted when I found her, but she's been stable since last night." The paramedics quickly began assessing Kelly's vital signs and checking her for injuries. They were amazed by her condition. While she was clearly tired and undernourished, she was in much better shape than they had expected for someone who had been lost for 3 days. "You probably saved her life," one of the paramedics told David. "Another night in the wilderness without food or water, and this could have been a very different outcome." Kelly overheard the comment and reached for David's hand. "He gave me his food, his blanket, his sleeping bag, everything he had. He stayed up all night to take care of me." The search and rescue coordinator looked at David with admiration. "That's exactly what you're supposed to do in a situation like this. You kept her warm, fed, and hydrated. Textbook wilderness first aid." As the paramedics prepared Kelly for transport to the hospital, she refused to let go of David's hand. "Come with me," she said. "Please, I don't want to go alone." David looked at the coordinator, who nodded. "There's room in the helicopter. We'll need to get your statement anyway, and the family will want to thank you." As they lifted off from the mountain clearing, David looked down at his abandoned campsite far below. He had come to the mountains to figure out what to do with his life, and somehow he had found his answer in the most unexpected way possible. The helicopter touched down at the regional hospital with a gentle thud, and David watched as the medical team rushed Kelly inside on a stretcher. Even though she was conscious and talking, the doctors wanted to run a full battery of tests to make sure she hadn't suffered any lasting damage from her 3 days in the wilderness. David sat in the helicopter for a moment, suddenly feeling exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept him going for the past 18 hours was finally wearing off, and his body was starting to realize just how tired he really was. His back ached from sleeping in the camping chair, his throat was dry from dehydration, and his stomach was growling from sharing his last bits of food with Kelly. "You coming inside?" asked the search and rescue coordinator, a friendly man named Tom who had been working mountain rescues for 15 years. The family is going to want to meet you, and we need to get your statement for our report. David nodded and climbed out of the helicopter. As they walked toward the hospital entrance, Tom shook his head in amazement. I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've seen what happens when people get lost in those mountains for 3 days. Usually it doesn't end well. That girl is incredibly lucky you were there. I just did what anyone would do, David replied, but Tom stopped, walking and looked at him seriously. No, you didn't. Most people would have shared some food and water, sure, but you gave her everything you had. Your blanket, your sleeping bag, your last meal, and then you stayed up all night to keep her alive. That's not what most people would do. That's what heroes do. David felt uncomfortable with the praise. He had never thought of himself as a hero, just someone who helped a person in need. But as they entered the hospital, he began to understand that his actions had meant more than he realized. The first person they saw was Kelly's mother, a woman in her 50s with tears streaming down her face. She was pacing back and forth in the waiting room, clutching a cell phone and talking rapidly to someone on the other end. Mrs. Johnson? Tom called out. I'm with Search and Rescue. We found your daughter. The woman immediately hung up her phone and rushed over to them. Where is she? Is she okay? Can I see her? She's with the doctors right now, Tom explained. She's going to be fine. And this is David, the man who saved her life. Mrs. Johnson looked at David with such gratitude that he felt tears coming to his own eyes. Without warning, she threw her arms around him in a tight hug. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for bringing my baby home. David hugged her back, feeling overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. She's a strong girl. She's going to be just fine. Over the next hour, the waiting room filled with Kelly's family and friends. Her father arrived from work, still wearing his teacher's clothes and looking like he had driven to the hospital at breakneck speed. Her younger sister came straight from school, her eyes red from crying. Kelly's college roommate showed up with a bag of clothes and toiletries, and several other friends arrived throughout the afternoon. Each person who met David had the same reaction, overwhelming gratitude mixed with amazement at what he had done. Kelly's father, a quiet man who taught high school mathematics, shook David's hand firmly and said, I don't know how we can ever thank you enough. You don't need to thank me, David replied. I'm just glad I was there when she needed help. Kelly's younger sister, a 16-year-old named Amy, looked at David with the kind of admiration usually reserved for rock stars or professional athletes. Kelly told me you gave her all your food and stayed up all night to take care of her. That's the most amazing thing I've ever heard. David felt embarrassed by all the attention, but he could see how much it meant to Kelly's family. They had spent 3 days thinking they might never see her again, and now she was safe in the hospital, recovering from her ordeal. When the doctor finally came out to give them an update, the news was better than anyone had expected. Kelly was dehydrated and exhausted, but she had no signs of hypothermia or any serious medical problems. She would need to stay in the hospital overnight for observation, but she could go home the next day. Can we see her? Her mother asked eagerly. She's asking for David, the doctor said with a smile. She says she won't rest until she knows he's okay too. David followed the family into Kelly's room, where she was lying in bed with an 4 drip in her arm. Her color was good, and she looked 1,000 times better than she had when she collapsed at his campfire the night before. There he is, Kelly said with a bright smile. My guardian angel. David sat down in the chair beside her bed. How are you feeling? Like I've been hit by a truck? Kelly laughed. But alive thanks to you. The doctor told me that if I had spent another night in the wilderness without food or water, I probably wouldn't have made it. David felt a chill run down his spine. He had known Kelly was in bad shape when he found her, but hearing it confirmed by a medical professional made him realize just how close they had come to a tragedy. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been there, Kelly continued. If you had decided to camp somewhere else, or if you had already gone home, I would have died out there, But I was there, David said gently. And you didn't die? You're safe now, and that's all that matters. Kelly's mother came over and sat on the other side of the bed. Kelly told us how you shared your food with her and gave her your blanket and sleeping bag. She said you stayed up all night to keep the fire going and make sure she was okay. It wasn't that big a deal, David said, but Kelly's father interrupted him. It was a huge deal to us. You gave up your own comfort and safety to help our daughter. We'll never forget that. As the afternoon turned to evening, David found himself becoming part of Kelly's extended family. They insisted he stay for dinner, ordering pizza to be delivered to the hospital. They wanted to hear every detail of how he had found Kelly and what had happened during the night. David told them about hearing the rustling in the bush, finding Kelly collapsed near his campsite, and his decision to share his food and sleeping bag with her. He described staying up all night to keep the fire burning and watching over her as she recovered. You're a special person, Kelly's father said. Not many people would have done what you did. I lost my job 2 weeks ago, David said quietly. My divorce was finalized last month. I've been feeling pretty lost lately, wondering what my purpose in life is supposed to be. But last night, taking care of Kelly, I felt more useful than I have in months. Kelly reached over and squeezed his hand. You found your purpose. You saved my life, and that's something that will matter forever. As visiting hours came to an end, David prepared to leave. He had been awake for almost 24 hours straight, and his body was demanding rest. But Kelly's family made him promise to come back the next day when she was released from the hospital. We want to do something special for you, her mother said. A proper thank you for what you did. David protested that it wasn't necessary, but he could see that it was important to them. They needed to find a way to express their gratitude, and he didn't want to take that away from them. As he drove home to his small apartment, David reflected on how much his life had changed in just 24 hours. He had gone to the mountains, feeling sorry for himself, wondering if his life had any real meaning. Now he felt like he had discovered something important about himself, that he was capable of selfless courage when it really mattered. 6 months later, David stood at the edge of the same campsite where he had first met Kelly, but this time, everything was different. The campsite was decorated with string lights hanging between the trees, and a small table covered with a white cloth sat near the fire pit. Kelly was there too, but she looked nothing like the exhausted, half-frozen woman who had collapsed at his feet that cold October night. She was wearing a beautiful blue dress and had flowers in her hair. Her cheeks were rosy from the mountain air, and her eyes sparkled with happiness. David could hardly believe this was the same person he had wrapped in his grandmother's blanket all those months ago. I can't believe you planned all this, David said, looking around at the romantic setup. How did you even get all this stuff up here? Kelly laughed, the sound echoing off the surrounding mountains. I had help. My dad and Amy hiked up here this morning with the decorations. They're hiding behind those trees right now, probably taking pictures. David shook his head in amazement. In the months since the rescue, Kelly had become much more than just someone he had helped in the wilderness. She had become his best friend, his confidant, and eventually, the love of his life. The weeks following her rescue had been a whirlwind of activity. Kelly's story had been picked up by the local news, and David found himself being interviewed on television and in newspapers. Everyone wanted to know about the man who had given up everything to save a stranger in the mountains. At first, David had been uncomfortable with all the attention. He still insisted that he had just done what anyone would do, but the more people heard the story, the more they realized how special his actions had been. The local fire department gave him a commendation for heroism. The mayor of their town declared a David Martinez Day in his honor. Letters poured in from people all over the country who had been inspired by his story, but the most important thing that came from all the publicity was the job offer. A local outdoor equipment company had heard about David's story and his military background, and they offered him a position as a wilderness survival instructor. It was perfect work for someone with his skills and experience, and it paid better than his old job had. I never thought losing my job would turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to me, David had told Kelly during one of their many visits while she recovered. If I hadn't been laid off, I wouldn't have gone camping that weekend. I wouldn't have been there when you needed help. Kelly had smiled and squeezed his hand. Everything happens for a reason. Maybe you were meant to be there that night. As the months passed, David and Kelly spent more and more time together. What had started as regular check-ins to make sure she was recovering well had gradually turned into coffee dates, hiking trips, and long conversations about their hopes and dreams for the future. Kelly had found work as an environmental consultant, helping companies develop sustainable practices. She loved her job, but she said it didn't compare to the sense of purpose she had found in starting a nonprofit organization focused on wilderness safety education. I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to other people, she had explained to David. Too many young people go hiking alone without proper preparation. If I can teach even one person how to stay safe in the wilderness, then maybe my getting lost wasn't completely pointless. David had been amazed by Kelly's resilience and her determination to turn her traumatic experience into something positive. She had started giving talks at colleges and outdoor recreation centers, sharing her story and teaching people about wilderness safety. She always made sure to mention David's role in her survival, describing him as the hero who had saved her life. I'm not a hero, David would always protest when he heard these stories. I just did what felt right. That's exactly what makes you a hero, Kelly would reply. Heroes don't think about themselves. They just do what needs to be done. Tonight, as they stood in the campsite where their story had begun, David was nervous. In a way he hadn't been since his army days. He had been planning this evening for weeks, working with Kelly's family to make sure everything was perfect. Kelly, he said, taking her hands in his. 6 months ago, I came to these mountains because I was lost. I had lost my job, my marriage had ended, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do with my life. Kelly listened intently, her eyes never leaving his face. That night when you collapsed at my campfire, I thought I was just helping someone in trouble. But you changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. You showed me that my life has purpose, that I can make a difference in the world. You helped me find myself again. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Kelly's eyes widened and she covered her mouth with her hands. I know we've only known each other for 6 months, David continued, getting down on one knee, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You are the most incredible person I've ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made me. He opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful diamond ring. Kelly Johnson, will you marry me? Kelly's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, David was afraid she might say no. But then she broke into the biggest smile he had ever seen. Yes, she said, throwing her arms around his neck. Yes, of course I'll marry you. As David slipped the ring onto her finger, they could hear cheering from the trees where Kelly's family had been hiding. Her parents, her sister Amy, and even some of their friends came out of their hiding spots, congratulating the newly engaged couple. I can't think of a more perfect place for this to happen, Kelly's mother said, wiping tears from her eyes. This is where you two met, where your love story began? David looked around at the campsite, remembering that cold October night when he had first seen Kelly stumbling out of the darkness. He thought about how hopeless he had felt then, how lost and purposeless his life had seemed. You know, it's funny, he said to Kelly as they sat by the fire later that evening. I came here that night thinking my life was over. I was unemployed, divorced, and feeling like a failure, but finding you changed everything. Kelly snuggled closer to him, admiring her engagement ring in the firelight. I was literally dying when I found you. I had given up hope. But you didn't just save my life. You gave me a reason to live it better. We saved each other, David said, kissing the top of her head. A year later, David and Kelly were married, in a small ceremony at the base of the mountains where they had met. Their wedding photos showed them laughing and dancing, surrounded by family and friends who had all been touched by their incredible story. David's new job as a wilderness survival instructor had led to opportunities he never could have imagined. He had written a book about wilderness safety that became a bestseller. He was regularly invited to speak at conferences and events. Sharing his knowledge and Kelly's story with people around the world, Kelly's nonprofit organization had grown into a nationally recognized program that had already helped thousands of people learn to stay safe in the wilderness. She had been featured in outdoor magazines and had even been invited to speak at the United Nations about the importance of environmental education. But despite all their success and recognition, David and Kelly never forgot the simple truth that had brought them together. Sometimes the most important moments in life come when we're willing to put someone else's needs before our own. David's decision to share his last meal and give up his warm blanket to help a stranger had not only saved Kelly's life, it had given both of them a future they never could have imagined. Every year on the anniversary of the night they met, David and Kelly returned to that same campsite. They would sit by a fire, sharing a simple meal and remembering how their love story had begun with one man's decision to help a stranger in need.